Thank you so very much. Is my sound on? Always need the sound on. Thank you, Lori. That was a wonderful introduction. And I want to begin by, first of all, thanking Connie and Rex for bringing me here today. I really understand that Connie, in particular, is the spiritual soul. Okay, is the spiritual soul of this wonderful organization. Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Okay, good. And it really is by her largesse and good graces that she gave me the privilege of coming here today. What I didn't know, which is really kind of amusing, and I sort of enjoy that, is that I understand that in this organization, COM, that the members call each other comrades. So I am delighted to be a comrade among comrades, which is very nice. And you all have created really a wonderful festival here. This is really the first of its kind that I've seen, in which you all have taken a very serious topic and created around it a tremendous positive energy, a celebration. And I am here to join in a celebration of you all, the organization that you've built, and also to use that opportunity to strengthen what I think already many of you have, because you're well on the way to feeling a sense of efficacy, power, and understanding in working with people in your lives who may have mental illness. And I'm going to be speaking today really out of my book, my new book, called You Need Help, a Step-by-Step Plan to Convince a Loved One to Get Counseling. And I'm going to try to touch on a variety of topics. They have much to share with you, and really I'm only going to be able to offer you the headlines of many of these ideas. And if you would like to have more text beneath those headlines, please feel free to join me, I think twice today, I believe, both in the morning and the afternoon, when I will have an open forum in which we can discuss things, where you can ask any question you've always wanted to ask of a psychiatrist. There are many things that I do, but the bulk of what I do is actually treat patients, treat families, have helped many, many families be able to steer or coax or invite and sometimes even force their family members into treatment, which is really the point of departure of this book. So this is going to be, I had a radio show for many years. We'll talk about that. My favorite shows were the Open Phones shows. So we'll have 2 sessions of open phones, except you won't need any equipment. Just come and show up. All right, so I'd like to take you, begin by a little bit of background and some important information that you need, and then I will try to go through a few examples of some of the things from my book that I think will help you understand that when it comes to trying to convince a troubled person who clearly has more trouble going on than you know how to handle personally and you feel needs professional attention, to convince you that the real power lies not in the professionals and the institutions and the agencies that are there, but the power that's often insufficiently tapped lies in loved ones, lies in family members. And you all are the ones who we in the professional community count on to be the root of the power of healing. And we're going to take a look at that. We're going to start by one of the things that Lori did not mention, Susan did not mention, is that I got you backwards. Sorry, Lori didn't mention, I had a wonderful afternoon yesterday with Susan and Lori, and they became such close companions that they seemed to be Sue Lori to me. One of the things that I do in my career is I've done a lot of consultation to Hollywood, and I've consulted on a number of movies to try to help them make more accurate portrayals, not just of the mentally ill, but actually of the treatment of mental illness and the treaters of mental illness, and particularly psychiatry, which Hollywood loves to distort psychiatrists. Matter of fact, I'm going from here to the American Psychiatric Association meetings, giving a talk up there about some typical distortions and archetypes that appear in Hollywood movies in the way they portray psychiatrists, portray our profession. But I'm going to use some movie references and clips today to help unfold this theme. So as I get to these things, I want to know how many people ever saw the classic movie Ordinary People, right? It was one of the first, and actually still remains one of the more iconically positive portrayals of treatment and also of mental health professionals. So this is just a little excerpt from the movie where the husband and wife, Calvin and Beth, have their son in a psychiatric institution, and the issue is whether they're going to go and have a family session. Calvin says, "I think we should go see him, Beth, Dr. Berger." Beth says, "What?" Calvin, "I think we should all go see him together." Beth, "Well, what does he, the doctor, know about me and about this family? I've never even met him." Calvin, "Exactly, that's the point. Wouldn't it be easier if we all talked about it out in the open?" Beth, "About what? What are we going to talk about? I don't want to see any doctors or counselors. I am me. This is my family. If we have problems, then we solve those problems in the privacy of our own home, not by running to some kind of specialist every time something goes wrong." So this attitude really exists far and wide, that for a variety of reasons that we're going to touch on, that mental illness, emotional problems, behavioral problems are troubles that need to stay in the sanctuary of family and be solved amongst ourselves. But unfortunately, some of these problems are beyond the capacity of a family to find solutions, and they need some kind of additional expertise to do that. And that's when you want to reach out for treatment. And therein lies the conundrum, how to actually convince the troubled person to move through that door. Here's another example. How many people have seen the series Breaking Bad? All right, Breaking Bad, which is about a wonderful series. At one point, at the height of the series, there were 3 million people every night watching this. I think now the total of people who've been exposed between the TV and the television is upwards of 40 million people have seen this. Here's a scene in which 2 officers of the DEA, one of whom is the one on the left, is developing clearly PTSD from a terrible incident, and he's falling apart and he's behaving in all sorts of dysfunctional ways, both at work and home. And his colleague, the one on the left, comes to talk to him about getting some help.
If you're not sufficiently stimulated by this investigation, do us both a favor and ask for transfer. Solving 2 things. Starting bar fights. Turning down an embezzle. And now this bullshit. You need to talk to someone or what? Talk soon. Talk now. Not trying to step on your toes, bro, okay? Just worried about you. That's all. Appreciate that. Bro. Now take your hand off my shoulder.
If there was ever a dramatic example of the cold shoulder, which is very often what you get. All right, so how did I get into being interested in this? So back in the 90s and through the early 2000s, I was Frasier. I had a radio show called Komrad on Call. We went to 41 states all over the country and had call-in shows. As I noted, I also often interviewed specialists and experts in various dimensions of mental health and psychiatry. And on this show, when I did have open phones, the most significant and common question that I would get all the time went something like this. My relative or friend is having some kind of emotional trouble that's beyond my ability to help. How can I convince him or her to see a doctor like you and get some professional help? So answering that question over the course of many years, both on that show and Then I went on to do a regular show on National Public Radio, where I still appear on a show more recently. I have accumulated a variety of angles on this question, and then ultimately developed in my own practice of psychiatry a specialty in which families typically come and consult me to see how they might be able to shepherd their troubled person into treatment through the most facilitative means, all the way through increasing uses of family power, and if necessary, ultimately the use of the power of civil authorities. All right, so why do we want to do this? Why is it important? It's important not just because suffering people need relief from their suffering, but because early intervention is very vital for being able to prevent the development of more full-blown conditions. I got this from my cousin, who's a dermatologist, but this is a tiny little lesion on the thumb. And I'm going to show you what happens if you don't have early intervention, and if you let things go untreated, unexamined, and unsolved. And I'm going to try to leave it on as briefly as possible, so prepare yourselves. That's enough. My wife ordered me to get that slide off as quickly as possible. So that's pretty serious. So when you get to that point, I don't think most psychiatrists, although I heard a story yesterday, would do this. The psychiatrist is sitting in the chair saying, "You're too screwed up, next patient please," and pulls the lever and drops them into the basement. Unfortunately, I did hear a story where that wasn't so funny, but most of the time it doesn't happen, I can assure you. Well, whatever your politics and your opinions about President Bush, one of the interesting good things that he did was he developed this commission, the President's New Freedom Commission on Mental Health in 2003. It's funny, they're trying to redo it now with Obama. It always seems like we're reinventing the wheel. But this commission made a variety of recommendations about how we can improve mental health care in America. And a quote from their report: "Emerging research indicates that intervening early can interrupt the negative course of some mental illnesses and may, in some cases, lessen long-term disability. New understanding of the brain indicates that early identification and intervention can sharply improve outcomes, and that longer periods of abnormal thoughts and behaviors have cumulative effects and can limit the capacity for recovery." By the way, we actually have a technical term in psychiatry to describe that phenomenon, and it's called kindling. Like a fire, which the longer you let burn, the harder it may be to put out. You know, what begins off, as a piece of paper pretty soon catches the drapes on the wall and the couch, and it's harder and harder to put out. And many, especially the major mental illnesses, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in particular, are potentially can be kindled in this way, that if you don't put out the fire early, it can be harder and harder to put it out as time goes on. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that research shows that the average person shows up for psychiatric care between 6 and 8 years after the onset of their illness. And so it's not uncommon for me to have to grapple with well-kindled cases. And so early intervention really can prevent that kindling and change the long-term trajectory of the illness over time. So, and unfortunately, this is what can happen. I'm going to take a bit of diversion into the current news and current events. Does anybody know who these children are? Some of you are shaking your head. This is who these children grew up to be. Adam Lanza of Newtown, Willie Cho of Virginia Tech, Jared Loeffner of Tucson, and James Hone of the Aurora movie theater shooting. So obviously these are the most dramatic examples, and actually, as a matter of fact, not typical examples of what happens when there's not early intervention. And as a result, it stimulated a great deal of talk and activity. I know on the East Coast, I haven't been following California news, but Sue Laurie informs me that it's not all that dissimilar here. The first big law was the New York gun law that basically has created measures to keep guns away from mentally ill people. And it's a separate topic, but I do want to just touch on this because it is so current about violence and untreated mental illness, because it is a phenomenon. Although most acts of violence are committed by people who do not have mental illness, 97% of all violence, particularly violence that leads to death, are committed by individuals who do not have a mental illness, so that's important to know. And that the worst mass murders one hears about are not the people that I just showed you, but it's typically by political terrorists, which, and we can talk about this in the afternoon workshop, is not considered mental illness, which is a fascinating distinction, but it's not. However, when acts of violence are committed by people with mental illness, they are almost universally committed by people who are not in treatment. Either have never been in treatment or have been in treatment but have stopped their treatment. And that most violent behaviors in which they engage are directed towards family members. This is something NAMI has been very interested in for years. So if you look at all murder of family member upon family member, all intra-family murders, about 70% of them are committed by an untreated person with a major psychiatric disorder. You can see the statistics as to who the victims are and who the spouses are. I turn your attention especially to the highest category, which is an untreated child, adult child typically, who murders their parent. This obviously is the position that Nancy Lanza was in. But we know from research that if you treat, there's a 50% reduction in the incidence of family upon family violence in general, and an even greater reduction in family murder. Now, however, I'm still on this current topic of guns and mental illness. The bigger story about guns and mental illness than homicide is suicide. Here is a chart from the CDC, and it shows every single state in the union. I know you can't see this from the back. The red lines are the homicide rates, and the blue lines are the suicide rates. Okay? And in every single one of these states, except for DC, Louisiana, and Puerto Rico, I guess they're calling that a state now. In all of those states, the suicide rate is much higher than the homicide rate. And how are suicides committed? Well, this shows you methods by which people commit suicide. And you can see that the majority of method is guns, not overdose, not hanging, but guns. And in fact, one of the things about guns is they are quite successful when used. 80% of the time when people try to kill themselves with a gun, they succeed. In contrast to overdose. In overdosing, they succeed 2% of the time. So it's 40 times more deadly suicide by a gun. And so 65% of all deaths in this country by gun, people killed by guns, 65, 2/3 of them are suicides. 2/3 of all gunshot deaths are suicide. And of those people who suicide, 2/3 of them, 60%, are not in treatment at the time. And that if you have a gun in the home, if you compare gun-owning homes to those who don't own guns, suicides are 5 times higher in gun-owning homes. And 75% of youths, 18 years or under, suicide by using a gun that is in the home. 75% of all youth suicides are done with a gun that is owned by the family. But the good news is that treatment, psychiatric treatment, reduces the rate of suicide by 66%. All right, so I wrote this book. to try to help empower, inspire, and instruct people about how to make those early interventions, how to get troubled people into treatment as soon as possible. And I have the table of contents there, and I'm going to take you through some of these chapters, at least touching lightly on a few examples of some ideas that are embedded in those chapters. But first, I want to point out that the foreword to the book was written by former First Lady Rosalind Carter, and many of you might be aware that Mrs. Carter has devoted her own career, her entire career really, to mental illness, its treatment, and trying to reduce stigma. I've given you some examples of 3 books that she wrote in the area, particularly the latest one that came out last year, Within Our Reach. And she talks about stigma, its history, health policy, and many of the things that she was very instrumental in creating. Unfortunately, stigma has not made the kind of progress that we would like. This is a report, a survey in the American Journal of Psychiatry that surveyed 666 random people, not psychiatrists, community people. And it asked them about simply yes or no. Do you think that mental illness is caused by a chemical imbalance? Do you think it's a genetic problem? Do you think it's caused by bad character? Do you think that it was caused by the way someone was raised? Bad parenting? Would you be willing to be the neighbor of a mentally ill person? Would you be willing to be a friend? And finally, would you marry to a family that had a family member who had mental illness? And it turns out that really the only thing that has changed in the course of the last 12 years is that there's been an improvement in people's understanding that there's some kind of broken part in at least the major mental illness, a chemical imbalance or a genetic problem. But as far as all of the stigma, that it's bad character, it's bad parenting, you wouldn't want to be a neighbor, you wouldn't want to be married, there's been no change. The red is 1996, the blue is 2008 in the course of the last decade. A decade, by the way, in which we've seen dramatic improvements in treatment and tremendous efforts, mine not the least of them, to try to educate the public about this, but there really has not been a significant change. So we need Mrs. Carter and the likes of her more than ever. All right, so I want you to just consider these 3 cases, okay? First case, a close friend of yours is acting strangely. And she have a long-standing lunch date every Tuesday, but lately she's been canceling at the last minute. When you call her at the office, the receptionist says she's not in. You ran into her husband at the grocery store, and he told you that she hasn't been sleeping well. She's been missing days at work. You don't know whether she's lost interest in your friendship, or whether she's having an affair, or whether she's having emotional problems and needs help. Second case. Last night, your adult daughter was at your house for dinner, as she always is on Tuesdays, but she was short-tempered and rude, and you've watched over the last few months as she's become more and more irritable. Lately, she arrives with a bottle of wine, but drinks most of it herself before the dinner is served. The next day when she calls you for dinner, she appears to have forgotten how rude she was the night before and never apologizes. This morning, she didn't call. Now you and your husband are worried that your daughter is abusing alcohol. You tried to talk to her about drinking, but she explodes. And now you're afraid to say anything because her temper is close to the boiling point. The third case. Your brothers called and suggested you should keep your living room curtains closed because they might be watching. Who's watching, you ask? The people in red cars. I saw 3 of them on my way home today, and they all had license plates beginning with the number 3. So I think they're watching people who have 3 kids like you. This conversation only adds to worries you've had about him, like noticing he isn't changing his clothes very much. And it seems to be a long time since he took a shower. And at the last family dinner with your parents, he came late, seemed very uncomfortable, and left abruptly. So, what do you do in these situations? My son's favorite thing in the world is The Simpsons. 15 years old. Mine too. So, with these kinds of people, you may be thinking, well, this person needs more help than I know how to give. And I need some professional advice about how to handle them. I'm not sure if they're going to be okay without that. Well, Abraham Maslow said, when all you have is a hammer, every problem tends to look like a nail. So there is a temptation, because we have mental health professionals and we have psychiatry and we have the new diagnostic manual that's coming out on Tuesday. I'm scheduled to be part of that launch. That's going to be quite a circus. It's already been a circus that describes all of the phenomenon of ways in which mental life can go wrong. One might think that every kind of trouble needs a professional, but it's just not so. There are some times when all you need is a caring friend or a supportive hairstylist. But there are times that you do need a mental health professional. So I go into some detail in the book about when that tipping point has occurred, when it's beyond the hairdresser's capacity to help. But I just put up here some of the signs that I accumulated from the American Psychiatric Association, Department of Health and Human Services, and the World Health Organization. Some of the common criteria that are listed by these bodies as to when we may be dealing with some kind of underlying condition that needs more than just a friendly and supportive chat. Marked personality change, strange ideas or grandiose ideas, excessive anxiety, prolonged depression, crying or apathy, extreme moods, highs and lows, marked changes in eating and sleeping patterns. I would include with that sexual patterns, talking or repeatedly thinking about suicide. The transient thought about suicide is almost universal, but repeatedly thinking about or talking about suicide. Abuse of alcohol and drugs, of course, excessive anger, hostility or violent behavior, inability to cope with problems in daily activities. In the diagnostic manual, the 5th edition coming out on Tuesday, almost every one of those constructs has included some criteria about functioning. It's not enough that you're just miserable. You've got to be miserable to the point that it's affecting your ability to function at work, at home, in school, in a variety of settings where you need to function. I also have Komrad's additional signs that it's time to consult a professional. And maybe they're embedded in those others, but they involve making others, anybody who's making others feel scared or making other people suffer by virtue of their behavior. That, to me, is a threshold for needing professional help. Problems caring for or regulating one's self in terms of self-care. I think that when something very traumatic has happened, you should at least go for a checkup, just like if you were in a fire and it singed your lungs, but you sort of feel okay, you probably should go and get an examination and maybe some pulmonary function tests, just to be sure, and the doctor may say, you're okay, keep in touch. Okay? Same thing when you've experienced something very traumatic, either in the past, or in your childhood, or recently. And I also believe, and this does not really necessarily involve mental illness, I think everybody should have an opportunity to debrief after a very long-standing relationship ends, so that you can come to terms, because the tendency, the natural human tendency is to blame the other guy, and walk off and feel they're not okay, I'm okay. But in point of fact, people, it takes two to tango, people bring their problems to the next relationship if they don't have an opportunity to do a little bit of self-examination, which I think can be an extraordinarily valuable thing. But that obviously is in a different category than mental illnesses. Right, so let me just spend a couple of moments sharing with you some insights into how we psychiatrists think about problems in mental life. So, you're all going to have your honorary psychiatry degrees by the end of this talk, if I do my job correctly. All right, so basically we think about mental life, mental functioning, as manifesting itself in three domains, three phenomena. Very simply, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Okay? And those are the three categories in which people can have symptoms of psychiatric, psychological, mental disturbances. And really every clinical construct that we have really involves some combination of these three axes of disturbances in the domain of thoughts and or feelings and or behaviors. All right? But, and this is, I think, a very important point. There's our new pending DSM at the top. It's very important to understand that mental illness is a highly heterogeneous category. And it's almost as unfair to use the shorthand mental illness or mental illnesses as it is for me to give you a lecture on physical illness. Right? I mean, isn't that an unbelievably broad category? Physical illness. I mean, it would almost not make much sense for me to stand up here and say, in physical illness this, and in physical illness you should approach that. You would need to break it down to, well, what are the different illnesses that you're talking about, and different illnesses need different approaches. But we tend to use four perspectives when we think about problems in mental life. So the first of those are diseases. There are certain conditions that affect people and manifest themselves in thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we understand are due to some broken part in the brain, or broken parts of the brain, more realistically. And some examples of those are schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder, or dementia. We really have come a long way to understanding that there are broken parts. We can get a little bit of a handle on what those broken parts are. It's a work in progress. We're mapping the brain. I think we're going to see tremendous advances in our lifetime over that broken part. And this tends to be the perspective in which the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, tends to specialize in supporting families and educating the public about those conditions that are best understood as a broken part in the brain. However, that is not the end of how we see and how we think about the problems of what can go wrong in mental life. There are also problems that have to do with people's traits. You know, we're all human beings, and like any human beings, we vary in a dimensional way. Some of us are taller, some of us are shorter, some of us are heavier, and some of us are lighter. Some of us have more rejection sensitivity, and some least. Some of us are more irritable and reactive, and some of us are less so. So we have dimensional traits, and when you have extreme ends of that dimension, that bell curve, if you will, and are trying to live in a society that is designed for people in the middle, when you think about IQ, you know, the people at the extreme ends of the spectrum tend to have troubles. Well, similarly with personality traits. So there are problems that we see that are due to that, mostly these personality disorders. So diseases are about sort of what you have. Traits are about who you are. Then there are problems that have more to do with what you've learned, what's been reinforced. What are you learning from your environment? What are you learning from your family and society? What behaviors have you engaged in that you may have been inadvertently rewarded for, or chemically rewarded for, such as with a substance? And they lead to abnormal behaviors that involve strong, irresistible impulses, cravings, and are hard to slacken even in the face of knowing that they're getting you into trouble. So those are the behavioral kinds of disorders that have to do not with what you have or who you are, but what you've learned. And then finally, there are some disorders, and this is really what Sigmund Freud put on the map, is that there's some things that have to do with your developmental years and how you grew up and the story, the meaningful story of your life. All right, so it's not that unusual with growing up in the home of an alcoholic father, let's say, who occasionally disappears on a bender and abandons the family, and you see your mom in tremendous upset for days at a time. It's not that unusual for a person like that to grow up and maybe have some difficulty with intimacy and making commitments in relationships. That's the story of their life, the life story. What Freud's problem was, he came up with this great idea and then he imperialized all of the rest of the problems in mental life, and the subsequent Freudians said, okay, well, we can tell stories that account for schizophrenia and stories, that account for bipolar disorder and so forth. It turns out not every problem in mental life can be understood as a story. Some can, some can't. So, stories, how you grew up. All right, another thing about how we think. We are very interested in changes from baseline. Somebody is one way for a long period of time and suddenly they're different. Suddenly their schoolwork is deteriorating. Suddenly they're not showing up to work. Suddenly they start to have problems sleeping. Suddenly they don't need much sleep. Suddenly they're possessed of ideas that are new to them, that have never really been part of their worldview before. A change from baseline, typically a change that results in a lessening, a lowering of their ability to function. Hence I have the line going down. Here's an example of that. I don't know if any of you remember Lisa Nowak, the wayward astronaut, who got with this marvelous, incredible, multiple degrees, and she got into the astronaut corps and so forth. Most of us hadn't heard of her until she made the news by driving across country for 3 nights in a row without sleep, wearing diapers so she didn't have to stop, and took ropes and kidnapped a rival to a lover that she was with. And she went from really altogether incredibly high-functioning astronaut to this, a change in baseline. So, why didn't she get help on her own? Why doesn't anybody get help on her own? Well, this slide could be an entire other lecture, so I'm just going to go through it quickly, and we can talk about it later if you want. We've already talked about stigma as an inhibition. Why do we even need a book like the one that I wrote? Why aren't people just showing up like they would if they have a swollen knee or suddenly develop a problem in their hearing? Why do they need a whole book to tell other people how to help them? So there are many inhibitions. Stigma is one of them. Another thing that I discuss in the book is what I call the Nike Nation. Just do it. Just do it. Self-reliance and the myth that free will trumps everything, and that we are all possessed of utterly free will, and that any problem that afflicts us, any trouble that we have, we can reverse through the application of our free will. And in point of fact, will, which by the way arises from the mind, which by the way arises from the brain, can actually be impaired, can be stymied by virtue of one of the problems that we're talking about today. So recognizing the limitations of will, free will, is a very important starting and talking point, for example, in the 12-step program, in which the first step is about what? Powerlessness, right, powerlessness. There's something more going on here than my will. I've thrown my will at it. It hasn't worked. I need something beyond will. I need help. I'm not sick. Nice technical term, anosognosia. As many of you are aware, probably from personal experiences, some of the more serious mental illnesses are so serious that they have, particularly the ones that involve broken parts in the brain, broken chemistry of the brain, interfere with the capacity of the brain to observe itself. So people don't think they're sick. They maybe think you're sick, not that they're sick, that there's nothing wrong with them. And that is a built-in phenomenon in certain, not all, in certain conditions. Denial, of course, needs not much explanation. This is a particular favorite among men, though it's not unknown among women. Of course, the tremendous misinformation. It's a fascinating thing that to be a psychiatrist, one has to be prepared for all sorts of energies in the world that seem to want to contradict this as a legitimate clinical science, clinical art, with a scientific basis and some value. So there's a great number of anti-psychiatry misinformations out there, rumors, people who've had one bad experience, which tends to go viral amongst their friends. And Hollywood doesn't help, and Woody Allen does not help. It takes too long is another inhibition. We are in the culture of the Maalox moment. Some of you may be too young to remember the commercial for Maalox with the little clock ticking, ticking, ticking. Relief in a Maalox moment, right? With 20 seconds or something, and you get relief. It ain't so in psychiatry. Some of these illnesses take a short time to develop. Many of them take a very long time to develop. And so far, we have very few treatments that work very quickly. We have a few. We have treating anxiety, we can do that quickly. Treating attention deficit disorder, we can treat that quickly. Not in a Maalox moment. It may take a couple of weeks. ECT, yes, we still do that, thank goodness. It's one of the most effective treatments in psychiatry. Electroconvulsive therapy, you can ask me about that later. 2 weeks, you're done. Forget about 8 to 10 weeks of medications. You can't make me the double-edged sword of civil rights that give people in our country, the freedom for self-determination. Unfortunately, the capacity for self-determination, as we will see a little more in a moment, is very much hobbled by certain of these conditions. People thinking the problem isn't in my mind, it's my body. I have some kind of cancer. I have many mental conditions manifest themselves with physical symptoms because there is a connection between the mind and the body. Of course, I'm in California. I think I'm preaching to the choir on that. Back in the East Coast, we have a little more problem with that. And many people go running off to internists and physiatrists and nephrologists and go on long, long journeys. One of the things that got me into psychiatry, I went to Johns Hopkins to be an internist, as a matter of fact. But I had taken a lot of psych courses and rotations in med school. I didn't have the courage to do psychiatry because we weren't a real doctor and all that kind of thing. So I went to Hopkins to go into internal medicine, and I served with this very esteemed and celebrated professor who got the really, really tough cases. And he would, put them in the hospital. In those days, you could do that and work them up out the wazoo for every obscure illness. And then the last guy to be called in after 2.5 weeks of consultants was the psychiatrist, the psychiatric consult. And more often than not, because it had gotten to that point, that actually was the answer, to look at it from that point of departure. And I was absolutely fascinated with those cases. But these were people who had been on long trips, long journeys around the treatment of problems in mental life, and took a great deal of effort and money to get them back to where they needed to be. And then, of course, financial barriers, which I talk about in my book, and there are actually a variety of workarounds in every community around that particular problem. All right, so the goal that I want to help you think about, and that I've written the book about, is really very simple. My book is simply to get them in the door, get that initial evaluation, to be able to just help that person standing on the outside of the door to walk in and get the evaluation. You don't have to know what's wrong with them. You shouldn't even try to figure out what's wrong with them. That's the purpose of the evaluation. Then once we know what's going on, then you can get another book, how to help a family member with depression, how to help a family member with schizophrenia, how to help a family member with substance abuse. But the goal is an evaluation. And what is the evaluation all about? Here's a word that, for strange reasons, and we can debate this later, tends to have a certain kind of negative resonance among the public. Diagnosis, labeling. Well, let me tell you something, that psychiatry stands in the tradition of 2,500 years of medicine. And for 2,500 years, since this guy, Hippocrates, and even before him, 325, the way of approaching problems in which human beings are going off track, whatever way they're going off track, whether it's how they pee, or how they see, or how they think, there is a very well-wrought, venerable approach to trying to rule out certain possibilities and to observe nature and to create constructs and say, this problem, I've seen this problem before. In fact, I've seen 100 cases of it. And I think it's a lot like those 100 cases. Okay? That's what we call diagnosis. So diagnosis is nothing more than the answer, what's going on here? And is this something we've seen before? And if we've seen before, we can then proceed to, and by the way, there are books written by Hippocrates, each with these titles, diagnostics, prognostics, and therapeutics. The two things that any healer is charged with is, number one, helping a person to heal, and number two is to say something about the future, what you can predict, what's going to happen with the treatment, what's going to happen without treatment. That's called prognosis. You have melanoma, right? It's nice to know that diagnosis. It's nice to know what's going to happen if you don't treat it. What are the odds if you do treat it? Prognostics, and what is the treatment? Therapeutics. Okay? All right, so let's dive in with some practical ideas. Okay? How to get started. The first thing that I want to talk about in the book, is how to pick the right time and place. And here are just a few ideas that I will share with you. I have a whole list of when not to approach. And by the way, I've seen this mistake happen. You may think it's common sense, but in point of fact, a lot of these times are convenient. You're proximate to people. You're with the person in the middle of the night if you happen to be married to them, even if you're not married to them. You're with family members at family events, so that it seems like a convenient time. You have loose lips when you are intoxicated. Or it seems as if the other person sometimes may be a little more mellowed when he or she is intoxicated. No. Okay? And in terms of modern technology, indirect communications. These are approaches that require good old-fashioned face-to-face encounters, not presenting it by email, unless you want to set up the appointment by email or Facebook or even regular mail. Because I think it is very important, if you're going to speak to somebody, that you begin by creating for them an anticipation. There's something very important that I want to talk to you about. You need some time to sit down and talk about it. That I need for you to listen to me and take me seriously, because our relationship is so important to me. The point of departure here, what the whole book is about, is it's a book for people who are in a relationship. When I first meet a new patient, I don't have a relationship with them. As a matter of fact, some people, it takes me a long time to cultivate and season a relationship. But there are other people in their lives, hopefully, with whom they have had cultivation and seasoning in order to be able to develop a context in which vulnerability, loving kindness that exists, and therefore approaching people explicitly with the notion our relationship is really important to me. And so I'm coming at you with something that I need to talk with you about, that because we have a relationship, because I love you, because I like you, because you've been such a dear friend for years, and I don't want that to change. You need to pick places that are emotionally neutral, maybe not in the old family home where there was terrible warring going on among family members, or a workplace where someone feels watched by their colleagues. But of course, if you feel unsafe, that needs to be a semi-public place. So, it's important to acknowledge, look, what I want to talk to you about is uncomfortable. I really recognize that. I would be uncomfortable myself. And I really accept that. I really don't want you to be uncomfortable, but I may not be able to help it. As I said, stating the importance of preserving the relationship, deploying the theme of love and concern up front. You do not use words like crazy or abnormal. You do not conclude in advance what is the diagnosis, but instead you focus on specific behaviors. Your sleep, the way in which you seem to wash the dishes, for 25 minutes going over the same dish over and over again. The fact that you have missed 5 days of work this month, focusing on specifics. Here's a tip that's worked for me on a number of occasions. Our anniversary is coming up. Something I really want for my anniversary that would mean more to me than jewelry, than anything you could buy in the store. What would be a great gift to me is if you would have just an evaluation for those specific behaviors from somebody. That would be a great gift to me. I've used that trick at least 5 times and it's worked. Or a great gift for the children. I've advised people to do that. If you have your own experience with treatment, share it. It's very valuable. Okay? And the pitch is, look, just go once. Just let's see what they have to say. Okay? And by the way, that once could be, and often should be, with maybe a doctor that you already know. Primary care physician who often doesn't know about the problems, interestingly enough. There's a whole body of research about that, but may really know the patient. Offer to make the appointment yourself. I've got Dr. Komrad standing by. He's ready to see you tomorrow at 2, next Thursday at 3. And if necessary, get rid of the financial barrier. It's too expensive. I'll pay for it. Don't worry about it. I've taken care of it. I will take care of it. Remove that financial barrier. And ask if you could go along, just to sit in the waiting room. Be there for support. If it's okay with the troubled person, I'll be available to answer any questions the doctor has about, my concerns and maybe to give me some advice about how I can help you. Now, you don't have to do this alone. There are a number of allies that you may need to appeal to. We've talked about the primary care provider. We've talked, there are other people too, clergy people, coaches. I've even had, especially in family businesses and so forth, going to the family member who's the boss can often be accessible in a way that working for a large corporation wouldn't be. I've had many, many people as they've struggled to try to figure this out, to send them to a support group like Tom, like NAMI, where you can mine the incredible wisdom of people who've been through this. And I say here also sometimes you may, as the caring person, want to consult a mental health professional yourself first. Most, I would say, of the consultations I've been involved in are the family members making an appointment with me without the troubled person, because they've already tried to pitch it, troubled person hasn't been interested. So they come to consult me and we brainstorm. It may take a number of sessions. You may have to try a number of these things. If you have your own mental health provider, you can brainstorm with your own mental health provider about this. I have a number of patients who are already established who brainstorm with me, okay, how do we help my sister take a bite of this apple that has been so nutritious for me? Here's a survey by Porto Novelli saying how likely is it that you would seek help from these people. Notice that all the mental health professionals are down at the bottom, 20%, 16, 14. Family, friend, you guys, or friend, are first. Second is the primary care doc, as we were talking about, a close second. And a little bit more distant third is the spiritual advisor. Obviously, that goes up in the community. All right, the core of my thinking about this and the core of my book is what happens if all of these persuasion techniques don't work. How to tap the power of the relationship that's inherent in the family. So some of you may be familiar with this term from this 1968 book, Tough Love. There have been a number of books written also for psychiatric professionals. The fact is that we in psychiatry, more than any other field in medicine, by virtue of the kinds of problems that we treat, are quite used to being able to help people and shepherd people to treatment that they may resist or may be totally against their will. And so these terms that have appeared in a great deal of writings, caring coercion or therapeutic coercion, beneficent coercion, are the moral center of what we're trying to do here. By the way, this is non-therapeutic coercion. She has her husband on the rack. And it says, Hannah finally managed to convince Sam to quit smoking before they were married. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about are, if a person is possessed of reason, then the concept of persuasion works, or can work, has a chance of working. But if they're suffering from a disorder in which reason is diminished, then persuasion is not going to be as successful, and you're going to need to come at it with, let's be frank, we're all adults here, I think, coercion, okay? And I don't want to mince words about it, therapeutic coercion. Coercion, the purpose of which is to restore reason, okay? That is, as you may have heard, I'm an ethicist. The only ethical kind of coercive approaches in medicine are the kinds of approaches that take a person who has diminished capacity, diminished autonomy, as we use the technical word in ethics, and whose goal is to restore or maximize their autonomy, to maximize their freedom, to maximize their health. And for that, we sometimes may need coercion. Okay, so what are coercive approaches for you as family members? Well, the first thing that you have to do is, if you are relating to a family member particularly, and by the way, the archetypal scenario of this is parents with an adult child, okay, who's impaired, right? And the first thing you have to do is to change in your mind your perspective from rights to the perspective of privileges. Okay, that being a member of a family, particularly as an adult, still being cared for or supported and so forth by your family, is not a right, it's a privilege, and with privileges come responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is the responsibility to look after one's health, to do what needs to be done for one's health. So, how in the world can you link taking those responsibility to privileges that you may have? And of course, again, this is a whole lecture in its own right, but I've given examples of various largesses that the family makes available sometimes to their family member that can be used as leverage to try and steer people into treatment. And we can talk about that a lot more because it's actually very important. I'm going to skip this slide, but I do want to know, does anybody see Homeland? Okay, Homeland. It's another very, very popular show. I'm not going to show this clip because I want to save time for one last clip. But in this clip, her husband, who is behaving very, very bizarrely and strangely, he's come back from the war, she basically threatens to leave him if he doesn't go and get some kind of professional help. And by the way, it works. The last thing on this list is the relationship, to put it stake. I'm not going to talk about intervention. There's a lot about it in the book. There are all sorts of do's and don'ts. It's a very delicate thing. Everybody thinks they have an idea of what intervention is about because of the television show. It's much, much more complicated than that. And then finally, and again, we can talk about this later, just the headlines. I have a whole flow chart here. This is in the book as well. Many, many people need guidance. If things get to the point where people are creating a sense of danger to self or others, I define what danger means in the eyes of most laws. I define what the limitations of this are, which is the whole concept of imminence, how imminently dangerous people are. And then what are the steps that you take to be able to, if a person needs it, to mobilize power that goes beyond the power of the family, which is the power of civil authorities. And there are many important things to know about how to optimize those outcomes, how to put the worst face on the story, not lie, but putting the worst face on the story. Which are the different steps that you as family members need to show up for and make sure you're given the story and not just letting the troubled person give the story as the only source of information. Sometimes it may be necessary if people are in the emergency room in the hospital and you may need to let the hospital know my home is closed to them. So you guys need to know if you discharge this person too early, you're going to be making a homeless person. That works. I've been on the hospital staff, let me tell you. that works, and insurance companies respect that as well. Because insurance companies often say, well, you know, let them go home to the family. They'll, you know, I'm sure, and then come to the day hospital, it'll be okay. And there's a lot of pressure to get them out. Sometimes you may need to close their home. If a person's in legal trouble, don't get them off the legal trouble. Negotiate with the prosecutor to make involuntary stipulations that you get treatment or you go to jail. Okay? If there's not a legal problem, I have ideas in there about how to create a legal problem, at least until such time as this country begins to adopt on a widespread basis outpatient involuntary commitment, which we do not yet have. So you have to use the legal system in creative ways. That's all I'm going to do. Ralph Waldo Emerson said it's one of the most beautiful compensations of this life that no man can sincerely try to help another without helping himself. And one of the things that you may want is your own professional mental health support to not just brainstorm how to do this, but to support you through the ongoing tribulations of trying to be helpful and be in a relationship with people who have a mental illness, so that you can not only have them show up for the evaluation, but keep them going. Because often, you know, the troubles don't end just because they begin treatment. Many people end up stopping treatment prematurely. And you don't give up. You keep trying all these things. You circulate back and try this idea, and then you try this idea, and you keep trying. All right, finally, many of you are aware, as I said, that I've done consultations to Hollywood. I did not consult on this movie. I wish I did. I should have consulted on this movie. It looks like I consulted on it because this movie, Hope Springs, how many have seen it? Hope Springs. Oh, a lot of people, good. This movie is basically, when I saw this movie, I turned to my wife afterwards and I said, they turned my book into a movie. And I didn't even sell them the rights. She does, in this book, everything right. She utilizes many of the things I've already discussed, a few I haven't, to convince her husband to get into treatment with her, marital therapy, for this relationship between this aging couple whose relationship is dying on the vine. And I have put together some clips, and underneath I've written in what technique she is using that I've spoken with you about at that particular moment. And you can see why it looks like the film version of my book. You ready with the sound? So the first one is find the right book. Could be mine, but... And you have the marriage you want for the people in the back. Read it. Do your research.
I can't tell you how many questions I get on what constitutes the perfect marriage. I get couples who think their marriages are over, who feel like it's impossible to regain what they once had. Well, it's not. It's not impossible. And it's not too late for anyone who truly wants it and is willing to try.
Make the pitch. In a neutral place.
No, I...
What? You just want to sit there? Okay. What do you got?
I want to go.
Dr. Bernard,
Bernard Center for Intensive Couples Counseling. You want to go to intensive couples counseling? Right.
We have the day. The rest of the day you can read or look around the town.
$4,000 for a week.
Well, it's intensive.
After we go play.
Well, I paid for it.
Prepay.
How?
I used my CD.
How'd you get access to your CD?
I called Vince.
Oh, call my office without talking to me.
I made a reservation for us.
Yeah, cancel it.
I want to go.
Have you been to see Dr. Lester? Maybe this has something to do with that hormonal thing. Then I don't know what to say. You're all right. You never.
You heard me ask for it.
Excuse me, did we not just get a new refrigerator because you wanted more? You're a problem. You can go anywhere you want to go, but I'm not going. So, would you want to go to intensive couples counseling all by yourself? I'll see you when you get back.
Maybe I will.
All right.
Maybe I will.
Expect the gift of treatment, accept no
Tell me
substitute.
how much you like me.
This is your boarding pass.
Oh, come on.
Flight leaves at 10:02 in the morning. What's wrong with you?
What are you trying to do us?
I want a real marriage again. Or
Mary, this isn't real after 31 years. This isn't real.
when's the last time you touched me? It wasn't just for a picture. When's the last time you kissed me?
I kiss you every day. We're not 22 years old anymore, and things change. I could be more, this is insane.
She said 10:02 tomorrow. I'm gonna be on it. You just have yourself on the table.
But you're not even gonna, aren't,
Good morning.
Where are we going today?
To the airport.
I hope you're happy.
Don't give up. Let your hope spring. We can do this. Thank you. So come later this morning, come this afternoon, and we'll actually have a dialogue rather than a monologue.
Exactly. So to go over a little bit for the day, before we do